was welcome back to our conference, Fellini, Italy, Cinema, and let's start with our panel, Beyond the Fellinian Framework. And our first speaker is Manuela Gieri, who is Associate Professor of Film, Television, and Photography Studies at the University of Basilicata, and who also taught Italian and Cinema Studies at the University of California, Davis, and at the University of Toronto. And Professor Gieri has published extensively in learned journals. She has edited volumes on Italian cinema and theater, and her main research interests are Italian and world film history, Federico Fellini, Luigi Pirandello, contemporary Italian women's writing, and new historiography. Among her works, deserving special mention are La Strada, Federico Fellini director, published in 1990, Contemporary Italian Filmmaking, Strategies of Subversion, published in 1995, Cinema dalle origini allo studio system, 1895-1945, published in 2009, and 20th Century Italian Filmmakers, published in 2020. The title of her paper is Imaginary Words and Startling Creatures, Federico Fellini and Popular Culture. Manuela?
Grazie, dunque, prima di tutto vediamo se riesco a fare quella cosa che abbiamo provato prima. No. Voi la vedete a tutto schermo o no? No.
Sì, vediamo, non vediamo la presentazione, vediamo il PowerPoint.
Infatti. Allora, interrompi condivisione. Scusatemi, voglio fare... Non che sia importantissimo, perché... Nel senso, faccio solo vedere delle immagini così per distrarvi dal mio volto. Che
questo è un PowerPoint? Is this a PowerPoint that you're trying to show?
Yes.
Okay, if you put Start Slideshow, if you select that in the PowerPoint.
No, è che prima ce l'ho fatta, adesso per qualche motivo non ci riesco.
Ah, ok.
Prima quando abbiamo provato l'abbiamo fatto, ma non riesco... Non so perché.
Prova a ricondividere lo schermo.
Non riesco a capire perché mi si apre con una modalità che non mi permette più di fare presentazione.
Però prima devi, scusa perché io insegno,
Dimmi.
prima devi aprirlo e trovare e andare subito, come ha detto Frank, a slideshow, and then fai lo sharing.
Ho capito, ma infatti prima abbiamo provato e ha funzionato benissimo. Adesso per qualche motivo mi si apre in un formato che non riesco a... Oh, ti prego. Eccolo. Ok, ho trovato. Allora... Funziona?
Sì, perfetto.
Funziona?
Perfetto.
Benissimo. È solo per distrarvi, in realtà non è che serva moltissimo, però
You
così.
have 3 minutes left.
I know. Oh, don't start, Frank, please. Only a few individuals have left a mark onto the history of Western civilization and have profoundly affected our collective unconscious. Only few directors have made a profound contribution to the enhancement of world cinema. One such individual and one such director, as we have been all saying, is no doubt Federico Fellini, whose journey to fame and artistic plenitude has run parallel to the development of Italian and Western contemporary culture, to the point that such culture, in its most popular forms, has constituted its very vital life. The focus of my contribution today is the development of Fellini's own authorial and filmic discourse as it was variously and profoundly influenced by multifarious forms of popular culture, Italian and otherwise, from comic strips to cartoons, from paper to audiovisual advertising, from radio to television, and so on. For the sole purpose of our meeting today, due to time restrictions, I shall merely outline the main points of my thesis, dealing with the influence of the various forms of Western popular culture, but most relevantly, with the ways in which those forms enter the very process of Fellinian communication, signification, and ultimately narration. In discussing the intricate relationship between Fellini and popular culture, Italo Calvino comes to my mind when, in Autobiografia di uno spettatore, the introduction to the Einaudi 1974 volume, collecting the screenplays of 4 early films, he rightly made us aware of the fact that la forza dell'immagine nei film di Fellini, così difficile da definire perché non si inquadra nei codici di nessuna cultura figurativa, ha le sue radici nell'aggressività ridondante e disarmonica della grafica giornalistica. Quell'aggressività capace di imporre in tutto il mondo cartoons e stripes che quanto più appaiono marcati da una stilizzazione individuale, tanto più risultano comunicativi a livello di massa. Thus, in spite of their unquestionable enunciative violence, the inexhaustible reservoir of dysphoric images present in satire, comic strips, and advertising, which were prevalent in the years of his youth, offered Fellini an alluring route towards the construction of an increasingly seductive filmic image, charged with expressive and narrative power, as well as communicative energy. Such awareness sheds a new light on his pre-cinematographic beginnings, as testified, for instance, by the collection of roughly 40 articles published in the Marca Aurelio in 1939 with the title Il raccontino pubblicitario. In those articles, Fellini offered an exhilarating and yet quite revealing parody of popular paper and radio advertising of the time. I shall not have the time today to expand on the relevance of advertising on Fellini's coming to creative maturity, but I shall certainly expand on it in the written version of today's talk because I believe it is truly important. On the other hand, it is a well-known fact that the history of Fellini's long and ineffable relationship with the various and diversified forms of spectacle and popular culture can be defined as an unexhausted and indefatigable itinerary of appropriation and remediation, but also of sheer seduction, which produced diversified outcomes in the course of the director's magic journey in the imaginary. One can truly speak of a fatal attraction, a true temptation towards the spectacular, a temptation which was at first merely internal to the narrative, as in his first directorial collaboration in Luci del Varietà, co-directed with Alberto Lattuada, but also in the many inserts scattered in his early films, such as Lo Sceicco Bianco, as Veronica Pravadelli has proved to us today, I Vitelloni, and yet even in La Strada and Le Notti di Cabiria. Such temptation eventually became woven into the fabric of the Fellinian filmic image itself, as it happens from Ottemezzo all the way up to La Voce della Luna. The journey leading to the apocalyptic and yet prophetic vision of La Voce della Luna lasted over 50 years. During this fascinating journey, the relationship between Fellini and the various forms of spectacle, or rather with the whole process of spectacularization of reality in its multifarious cultural expressions, from comic strips and cartoons to variety shows, from the circus to advertising and television, experienced various stages of development. Indeed, as his cinema moved from an initial proximity to the neorealistic mandate to a decisive move away from it, the startling world of popular culture contributed to the construction of Fellini's personal and idiosyncratic filmic narratives. What is intriguing to me, however, because all of this has been written on and has been said so many times, but what is intriguing to me, however, is to comprehend how the multifarious forms of popular culture at first became intertwined with his unconscious life and then came not only and simply to make an appearance in his narratives, but how they truly participated or rather insinuated themselves in the creative process. Furthermore, what is relevant to me is to understand the ways in which and by which those forms came to be remediated by the artist, at first in his oniric experience and then in his imaginary worlds. In short, the question to be answered to me is, what is the channel through which they entered the process of communication, of signification, and then of narration? I thus searched for an appropriate methodological tool that would allow me to identify such channels. And in addition to the many theoretical threads so masterfully outlined today for us by Veronica Pravadelli, I may have found, I hope, a useful venue by referring back to Greimas' interpretation of the process of communication and signification. According to the semiotic approach developed by Greimas, and I'm here referring, however, particularly to his last work, Dell'imperfezione, published in 1991, it is quite relevant to reflect upon aesthesia and empathy, as well on the aesthetic processes in both communication and narration. If we assume that the communicative process grows with and is a constitutive part of the text, one must note that at the foundation of both signification and communication, which, as we all know, in semiotic terms are the same thing, one finds an aesthetic articulation, an empathy. Thus, we may speculate that signification generates from a connection with the world that pre-exists it, and that such world may be defined as aesthetic. In such a perspective, empathy and aesthesia imply the articulation of feeling and thinking, and they are articulated and textualized dimensions rather than being mystic or transcendental ones. An accurate semiotic approach to a text must thus focus on such articulations and their networks. Within such framework, the notion of communication, even though still fundamentally represented by texts, acquires a further dimension. It is no longer merely a process of interrelation and negotiation of meaning in view of a connection to be, but it is a founding dimension of signifying processes. We signify and communicate because we experience and articulated aesthesia with the world, with ourselves, with others. We communicate because we are already in a relation with others and with the other in ourselves, and not to enable ourselves to establish such a relation. In an interview given in 1991, Paolo Fabbri, che come tutti sappiamo in Italia è stato uno degli esegeti delle posizioni di Greimas, concludes that the various articulations of the communicative process are thus inspired by and move from aesthetic or synesthetic articulations. I suggest that such an approach may thrust open new and unforeseen territories in our study of the relationship between Fellini and popular culture, as well as of the ways in which those forms insinuate in his creative process. Mi chiamo Federico e il mio cinema è nato dai fumetti. It is thus Fellini himself to indicate the way in an interview granted to the daily paper L'Unità on Sunday, July 26, 1992, in which he focuses on Il viaggio di Mastorna, detto Fernet. a cartoon version by Milo Manara of the filmic project that Fellini nourished since the 1960s, rewrote several times, but never realized. In such interview, the director remembers the days of his youth. Il mio amore per il fumetto si perde nella notte dei tempi. È stato il primo contatto con un mondo immaginato che si esprimeva con le matite, con le penne, con i colori, qualche cosa che non aveva a che fare con la scuola, con la chiesa, con la famiglia. Mi ricordo che una data festosa della settimana era proprio la domenica, quando papà, tornando dalla stazione dove c'era l'edicola più fornita di Rimini, ci portava il Corriere dei Piccoli. Mi affascinava il modo tipico del fumetto di inquadrare le immagini in una cornice, la sua scansione narrativa, il salto di immagine da un quadretto all'altro, l'affidare al lettore il compito di colmare i vuoti, di rendere dinamica la staticità. In fondo quei primi film sono dei fumetti animati e tutto si richiama alla tecnica del fumetto, dalle prospettive al taglio dell'inquadratura, quel taglio particolare che si ferma alla caviglia e che prese il nome di piano americano. Thus, comic strips served as a process of, let's say, alphabetization to the world of the moving images, as well as a venue to the construction of Fellini's own universe. The rich and multifarious world of paper cartoons, combined with early silent comedies, and then with the multicolored world of circus, advertising, and later on of television, they all contributed to the shaping of the director's imaginary worlds, filled with startling creatures inspired by Western popular culture, and yet immediately translated in a personal and idiosyncratic language. As you all know, in a few occasions I have reflected on Fellini's. Sto saltando perché naturalmente anche io ho molto tagliato, ma solo per darvi alcune idee di dove sto andando e avere da voi anche, spero, un po' un feedback se sto andando dalla parte giusta. In a few occasions, come sapete, I reflected on Fellini's meditation over the relationship between cinema and television, as well as on their many differences as means of expression and communication. Such reflection began with Block Notice di un regista in 1969. The feelings of attraction and repulsion the director experienced towards television are therefore familiar to most of us. On the one hand, he was attracted to the potential for synthesis and immediacy inherent in TV storytelling and to the possibility of a higher degree of intimacy with the TV spectator. On the other, he became increasingly aware of the power of fragmentation of the récit as a result of zapping, as well as of the constant and obtrusive commercial interruptions. Furthermore, he grew conscious of the progressive lowering of the relationship between spectacle and spectator, deprived as it is of any kind of magic and seduction in the asphyctic familiarity of the domesticated environment of a mass-mediatic house. In the long interview Fellini granted to Charlotte Chandler, the director synthesized with eloquence what is, I believe, his conclusive position on the medium of television while commenting on his decision to shoot Prova d'Orchestra. For me, however, I'm quoting, the decision to work on the small screen went beyond the question of morals, technical limitations, or aesthetics. I had done television twice before, A Director's Notebook and The Clowns, but each time it meant walking into a fog of blurred, confused images. I felt ambivalent about contributing again to the jumble of images with which television fills our minds every second of the day and night. Insidiously, it seduces us, obliterating every vestige of discernment, substituting an alternative synthetic world to which we must adjust. Worse yet, we want to adjust to it. I see television and its viewer as two mirrors facing each other, reflecting between themselves an infinite void, endlessly monotonous. The question we must keep asking ourselves is, do we believe what we see, or do we see what we believe? Such questions somewhat aids us in our effort to map and interpret Federico Fellini's journey in the multifaceted universe of Western popular culture, insofar as its characters, places, and phantasmatic images are replicants of mental and imaginary worlds. They become progressively familiar as they appear over and over and aid the director in the construction of the alchemical objects of his possible worlds. Fellini's journey was indeed nothing but a long and uninterrupted itinerary in the world of possibility, in the mysterious and ineffable universe of the imaginary, following the enveloping and alluring coordinates of dream, seduction, and desire. It is perhaps by pursuing such path of inquiry that one shall better understand the mysterious, at times disquieting and yet always seductive presence of spectacle, if not of the spectacular, in the long and uninterrupted film Fellini fabricated during an entire life. The relationship was not unilateral, as we all know, as countless are the cases of true cannibalism exercised by audiovisual and paper forms of spectacle on the large and sensuous Fellinian filmic body, made of images and sounds, light and movement. That body has been repeatedly appropriated and reproposed as an icon or a myth of Western culture. Then it has been progressively emptied and incessantly replicated as an unrestrained and exciting simulacrum of itself and of that very culture. And thus on screens and telescreens, on billboards and tabloids, the phantasmatic forms of Anita and Marcello in the Trevi Fountain, or the beaches enveloped in cerulean lights and magic atmosphere, materialize and disappear in an incessant motion, in an eternal transit. These images offer us fragments of I Vitelloni, Amarcord, and the Satirico nel Casanova, frozen in an eternal present time, and thus become the traces of that which was, for many of us and for a long time, the world. In an unstoppable process of simulation, the Fellinian filmic body annuls itself in the obliteration of the border between the real and the imaginary. As Jean Baudrillard once stated, in our time, the principle of simulation wins over both the reality principle and the pleasure principle. This is the apocalyptic and even though shadowy, yet not iconoclastic atmosphere that dominates the last filmic vision generated by Federico Fellini, La Voce della Luna, the poem of those great simulators, which are the lunatics, the fools. And yet, at the end of this last film, it is Fellini himself who seems to be proposing a way out of the labyrinth. Through Ivo Salvini's Roberto Benigni's request for silence as the only possibility to acquire access to meaning and signification, Fellini is undoubtedly calling for the sensoriality of experience. It is thus by activating an aesthetic circuit that one could better understand both Federico Fellini's creative process as well as once again circulate the Fellinian body, an indefatigable producer of oniric phantasmagoria and seductive objects of desire which are perpetually fluctuating in the universe of possibility. Ce l'ho fatta stare nel tempo? Sono stata lunga anche stavolta? Figurarmo, ci sono 5 pagine adesso. People who don't know me and who don't know Frank and Daniela don't know what this is about.
I should have done it too. I just wanted more time, and that's why I just sent mine.
Blah, 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 blah. 5 pagine. 5 pagine.
Thank you very much, Manuela. Could you stop the
yes, scusate.
Thanks a lot. Thanks. Thank you very much. And our next speaker is Andrew Monti, who is assistant professor at York University and a lecturer at Ryerson University. And Andrew will read Ottavio Cirio Zanetti's paper and of course, after the obituary earlier today. So, Andrew, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I will share a screen now. Here we go. Perfect. Okay. So before I start, I just wanted to really thank all the panelists and presenters. Ottavio was really passionate about film and cinema. He would have absolutely loved to be here with you today to listen and participate in the conversation. He also wrote a paper on Fellini's relationship with cartoons, fumetti, and teatro di varietà, which is uploaded to the conference website. The paper I will read now summarizes and previews the latest project he was working on before he passed away. Even though he is not with us today for the Q&A, I'm sure he would appreciate your comments and feedback on his research if you wish to discuss it. I will read it now in the original Italian. L'urbanistica di Federico Fellini, di Ottavio Cirio Zanetti. Federico Fellini non ha usato le città solo come scenografie dei suoi film, ma in alcuni casi come protagoniste. È il caso di Roma e della Rimini di Amarcord, o coprotagoniste delle sue narrazioni, per esempio Venezia nel Casanova, costruendo una sorta di personale urbanistica motivata non solo da valutazioni estetiche, ma anche da analisi di comportamenti sociali, da funzioni urbane, da definizioni del territorio. Il progetto di ricerca intende analizzare come Federico Fellini ha raccontato le città nei suoi film, come le ha fotografate, come le ha scelte nelle sue inquadrature e percorse nel montaggio, oppure come le ha reinventate. Fellini rimase colpito da Barry Lyndon, che Kubrick girò nello stesso periodo del suo Casanova. Kubrick ha dilatato il Settecento in inquadrature vastissime, io invece ho fatto l'operazione inversa, l'ho compresso in ambienti piccoli. La settecentesca Venezia felliniana è stata tutta ricostruita nello studio 5 di Cinecittà con l'apporto di un numero sorprendente di scenografi, aiuti scenografi, architetti, Danilo Donati, Antonello Geleng, Rinaldo Geleng, Giovanni Giannesi, Giantito Burchiellaro, Giorgio Giovannini e lo stesso Fellini come autore della ideazione scenografica. Per sottolineare la dichiarata falsità di Venezia, anche la laguna è visibilmente artificiale, interpretata da un telo di plastica. Venezia avrebbe dovuto essere la protagonista di un altro film del regista, pensato per la televisione e mai realizzato per difficoltà produttive. Era affascinato dalla Venezia nascosta, quella celata agli sguardi dei veneziani e dei turisti, la foresta di palafitte che la sorregge. Fellini diede incarico a Jacques Picard, figlio dell'esploratore Auguste Picard, di fotografare le fondamenta della città. Ho visto le foto subacquee delle fondamenta di Venezia, impressionanti, pali fitti come alberi della foresta amazzonica. Non solo Venezia è stata ricostruita a Cinecittà, anche la sua Rimini non è mai stata ripresa dal vero da Fellini. Mi sono del tutto inventato la mia infanzia, ha dichiarato il regista, nell'intento di renderla più autentica, falsificandola. Le sue memorie infantili hanno così preso forma nell'abituale Studio 5 a Cinecittà, il mitico Grand Hotel, le barche nell'Adriatico per salutare il Rex, le piazze, il corso, la chiesa. In parte somiglianti, in parte reinventate, con la collaborazione è invece il risultato di un collage urbanistico. Non un fotogramma del film è stato girato a Rimini, in questo caso non tanto per falsificare il ricordo, ma piuttosto per inseguire Alberto Sordi impegnato in una tournée teatrale tra Roma, Firenze, Viterbo. La stazione di Rimini, da dove Moraldo parte per Roma e idealmente per il film che accosta il degrado all'eccellenza monumentale. Un'urbanistica caotica nello spazio, le trattorie all'aperto, i bambini nelle strade, una pensione popolare, gli ingorghi nel raccordo anulare, un teatro di avanspettacolo, la costruzione di una galleria della metropolitana, Trastevere e la festa dei Noantri, gli hippies a Piazza di Spagna, un vecchio bordello, i motociclisti rombanti nella notte. E un'urbanistica caotica nel tempo, che frequenta gli anni dell'arrivo del protagonista, Fellini giovane, nella Roma del fascismo, con eventi contemporanei all'epoca del film, il 1972. Il regista che gira in location affollate di turisti e deve difendersi dalle accuse degli studenti di essere disinteressato alla politica, una sfilata di moda ecclesiastica, l'ultima apparizione sullo schermo di Anna Magnani. La raffigurazione dell'urbanistica nostalgica della Roma conosciuta da Fellini al suo arrivo nel 1939 è come affettuosamente ricalcata sulle vignette di Attalo, il disegnatore della rivista satirica Marco Aurelio, autore di personaggi come il Gagà che aveva detto agli amici e Genoveffa la Racchia. Grande ammiratore di Attalo, Fellini lo conobbe nella redazione del Marco Aurelio, dove il futuro regista, allora diciottenne, collaborò con racconti e vignette. Quando ho fatto il film Roma, ho voluto proprio ricordare le vignette di Attalo, intanto come ispirazione autentica, e poi anche per fare un omaggio a questo gentile, delicato e violento disegnatore. È una Roma sottoborghese, quella di Attalo, sformata e greve, tanto autentica quanto lontana che il regista riminese in parte aveva già citato nel 1953 in Agenzia matrimoniale, uno dei 6 episodi del film L'amore in città, progettato da Cesare Zavattini. Prima della capitale degradata di Roma, nel 1969 il regista aveva affrontato le origini antiche del mito della città in Fellini. Scaccianoce. Per il regista il film doveva essere un saggio di fantascienza del passato e l'edificazione della capitale della decadenza, territorio ospitale di un inconscio collettivo, si impone con una abbagliante invenzione figurativa, arcana, allucinata, misteriosa, onirica, junghiana. Se con Fellini Satiricon ha esplorato un possibile mito arcaico, il regista ha contribuito a rifondare un mito contemporaneo e internazionale di Roma con una messa in scena inedita delle sue location, anche quelle più turistiche. Anita Ekberg, che si bagna nella fontana di Trevi, dona al monumento una identità nuova, destinata a restare intatta nel tempo e citata come la gonna di Marilyn Monroe che si solleva in Quando la moglie è in vacanza. E così Via Veneto nella Dolce Vita del 1960, luogo deputato dove seppellire il neorealismo, allestendo la celebrazione disincantata e fatua di una capitale che si è dotata di velleità cosmopolite da rotocalco, suggerite dal boom economico. Una sottintesa e maligna vena di satira, raccolta in chiave parodistica da Totò, Peppino e la Dolce Vita, girato nel 1961 da Sergio Corbucci, riutilizzando gran parte della costosa scenografia allestita per il film di Fellini. La Ekberg, in Le tentazioni del dottor Antonio, episodio di Boccaccio 70 del 1962, contribuisce a celebrare anche il quartiere dell'Eur, resa monumentale dal regista che realizza così il sogno di filmare La Géante di Baudelaire. Ai piedi della giovane gigantessa c'è Peppino De Filippo, gatto poco voluttuoso ma angosciato da turbamenti sesquipedali quanto la sua partner. La Ekberg, anziana, è riapparsa nel 1987 in Intervista, film autobiografico dove Fellini si muove in quello che davvero sente come territorio personale, la città davvero sua, e che utilizza anche da lettino dello psicanalista, Cinecittà. Lo intervista una troupe di giornalisti televisivi giapponesi a proposito di America, film in preparazione tratto dal romanzo di Kafka, e Fellini divaga. Racconta il suo primo incontro nel 1940 con Cinecittà, dove intervistava una diva famosa. Il regista ripropone l'urbanistica schizofrenica già percorsa in Roma. Simili a edifici di epoche diverse in una città, i suoi ricordi si accostano e si confrontano con eventi contemporanei, gerarchi in divisa insieme a Marcello Mastroianni nel frac di Mandrake, il mago dei fumetti a cui Fellini avrebbe voluto dedicare un film. Con la bacchetta magica del personaggio creato da Lee Falk, Mastroianni fa riapparire le immagini della dolce vita e il suo ballo con Anita. Nel finale Cinecittà è in pericolo, un gruppo di nativi americani con tanto di piume e a cavallo circonda gli studi cinematografici e combatte usando come lance delle antenne televisive. Dopo Ginger e Fred del 1985, Fellini racconta nuovamente il suo fastidio e la sua diffidenza nei confronti della televisione, nel tentativo di esorcizzarla, di impedire che Cinecittà diventi un reperto archeologico, come la Roma del Satiricon. A proposito di Venezia, Fellini voleva fare un film sulla città che mettesse a confronto realtà e finzione, che proponesse una realtà stilistica nel suo cinema e che svelasse un'immagine sconosciuta della laguna, la foresta di palafitte sottostante. Oltre la Venezia immersa nella laguna, Fellini era attratto dalla città vista dall'alto, sorvolata dall'aereo, un indecifrabile alfabeto di segni geroglifici. Infine, che riproponesse la sua insofferenza nei confronti della televisione, al punto di immaginare Venezia acquistata da un simil Berlusconi. Il film, aveva scritto Fellini, avrebbe dovuto essere una serie di tasselli che si separavano, disintegrando il racconto in una scomposizione molecolare continuamente minacciata da una interiore frammentazione e che pure svela nel suo insieme il miraggio di una unità o di una visione. Fellini aveva immaginato di sdoppiarsi per l'occasione in un anziano regista americano in visita alla città degradata, occupata, presidiata dalle minacciose orde di turisti. A bordo di un battiscafo il regista visita la Venezia sommersa ed emersa la visione doveva poi contemplare una storia d'amore tra il regista e una dama veneziana, ritrovata dopo anni di assenza. Tutte le donne di Venezia hanno il suo volto, realtà storica e possibile realtà futuribile. Fellini immagina la città sommersa, annegata definitivamente dallo scioglimento dei ghiacciai. Rispetto alle altre città, Rimini e Roma, questa Venezia felliniana doveva rappresentare un'ulteriore esperienza urbanistica, una Venezia completamente reinventata, al confine tra realtà e finzione, sospesa tra cielo e laguna, tra documento e invenzione. Una Venezia antica e inedita. Il principale paper di Ottavio Cirio Zanetti è stato caricato in video sul sito del convegno dal titolo Il mondo grafico di Fellini. Grazie a tutti ancora per l'attenzione e ancora un grazie veramente di cuore agli organizzatori per il supporto.
Andrew, thank you so much for reading Ottavio's paper, and which was really important addition to our conference, I would say. It's been very interesting. And let's now move on to Eleonora Sartoni. Eleonora is an instructor of Italian at Duke University. A book manuscript titled A Capital on Paper, Rome's Monuments and Public Space in Cultural Representations of the Nation from 1870 to 1895, investigates the symbiotic relationship between monuments, architecture, urban plans, and popular media in the creation of Rome's national identity. Her research interests focus on cinema, urban studies, biopolitics, eco-criticism, and literature, exploring the relationship between body, society, and space. She has published articles in the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies and in Senses of Cinema. And the title of her paper is National Identity and Heterotopia in Fellini's Le Tentazioni del dottor Antonio. Eleonora?
Thank you, and let me share. I don't know if I, okay, yes, I have it. I'm sorry. Okay, thank you for the introduction and also for organizing this conference. And can you hear me? So in this short paper, which is a part of a larger project, I analyze how Federico Fellini's Le tentazioni del dottor Antonio displays Eur as a fictional paradise embodying the economic success of Italy in the 1960s. Yet, at the same time, the film shows the risks and the limits of the economic miracle. Because of this ambivalence, Fellini's use of Eur seems to oscillate between the Foucauldian heterotopia of compensation and the heterotopia of illusion. To the Christian democratic bourgeoisie represented by Antonio Mazzuolo, the new neighborhood is, quote, a space that is other, another real space as perfect, as meticulous, as well arranged as ours is messy, ill-constructed, and jumbled, unquote. In my reading, Foucault's Hours represents Italy before the economic miracle, as well as those neglected areas of the nation and beyond that are not reached by economic advancement and social progress in the 1960s. This kind of heterotopia opposing an imperfect society is one of compensation. However, Eur and the space in front of Anita's billboard, in particular, are spaces, quote, of illusion that expose every real space, all the sides inside of which human life is partitioned as still more illusory, unquote. This is heterotopia of illusion. This paper suggests how the reconstruction of Italian national identity in the aftermath of World War II overlaps with the economic boom and the advent of a consumer capitalist society in the creation of homogenized, disciplined individuals. Fellini's choice of Eur as setting for Le tentazioni has a strong weight in the creation of meaning in the film. Beyond the director's fascination with it, which he explains in an interview on Anna Zanoli's TV show EOE of 1972, Eur still retains a strong fascist identity in its architecture and urban plan, and because of this, it helps in creating a parallel between Italy's fascist past and the 1960s oppressive Christian democratic government, as also Zambenedetti has already pointed out. As Fellini states in the mentioned interview, Eur is, quote, una specie di sogno folle, interrotto e poi tramutato in un'altra cosa, unquote. Beyond its evident orthogonal structure and futuristic architecture, Eur represents a utopic social project because its development as a residential area at the end of the 1950s housed the Roman upper bourgeoisie in a new neutral setting, completely separated from the city center. Indeed, Mia Fuller identifies Eur as a, quote, post-dialectical colonial city, one that operated in a universe where difference had already been overcome. In Eur, there was no longer any mediator between differences, any fear of contamination, unquote. As a matter of fact, in the mid-1950s, Eur had grown from a deserted collection of grotesque, half-completed buildings and monuments inhabited by refugees and Gothers into a model community linked by a subway as of 1955 to the Termini railway station, unquote. Going back to the 1960s Eur, even Fellini in the mentioned interview underscores that, quote, la gente che ci abita ti dà l'impressione di avere una psicologia così, asettica, nuova, sconosciuta, unquote. In the director words, Eur and its upper bourgeoisie inhabitants are new to the Italian scene, and for this reason, not totally comprehensible. Eur embodies a model community, as Fritz points out, that is Foucault heterotopia, quote, an effectively enacted utopia, unquote. But let's discuss the film. How does Fellini play with this utopia? How does he use it to represent Italy during the economic boom? Throughout the film, Fellini alludes to the victory of consumer capitalism, especially by making the billboard the new focal point of social life in the neighborhood. Antonio constantly monitors the crowd night and day, and this is as variegated as the masses gathered in front of the billboard when it was assembled. During the day, the area is mostly frequented by families having picnics, young people arriving with campers or lining up their cars as in a drive-in, and also children playing Ring Around the Rosie. At night, prostitutes position themselves under the billboard. Consumerism reaches, or at least attracts, every layer of society, independent of their age, gender, and social or geographical origin. Another relevant point is that consumer capitalism manages to modify people's everyday routines. This aspect represents the fourth principle of heterotopias, quote, the absolute break with traditional time, unquote. Indeed, when Antonio dictates his observation to his assistant, he affirms that, quote, dalla finestra vedo il turbamento impossessarsi dei passanti davanti al tabellone, che si fermano come presi da improvviso malore, interrompendo la loro sana ristoratrice passeggiata, il ritmo della loro attività quotidiana. Unquote. Antonio's exaggerated narration of the effects of the billboard also alludes to changes in the Italians' customs like daily strolling, which now is continually interrupted by advertising billboards and shop windows, displaying highly desired commodities that create anxiety and cravings in the population, like Anita's sexuality, for example. It is also important to analyze the relationship between the people gathered in front of the billboard in order to understand that the rhythm of everyday life changes with the advent of consumerism and how people relate to one another. Anita and her billboard function as a spectacle, attracting viewers. This means that the consumeristic society based on appearances and superficiality is the society of the spectacle as intended by the board. Indeed, according to him, quote, the spectacle has its roots in the fertile field of economy, and it is the produce of that field which must, in the end, dominate the spectacular market, unquote. Therefore, Fellini's presentation of Anita's billboard as a cinematic screen as a dual purpose, on a more superficial level, it advances the director's complaints about censorship in Italy. On a deeper level, it allows Fellini to parody consumeristic society. If we observe how people interact in front of the billboard, we can see how the board's description of the spectacle as the modern form of modern society exactly fits Fellini's staging of the crowds in front of Anita. Quote, the spectacle appears at once as society itself, as a part of society, and as a means of unification. As a part of society, it is that sector where all attention, all consciousness converge. Being isolated, and for that reason, this sector is the locus of illusion and false consciousness. The spectacle is not a collection of images, rather it is a social relationship between people that is mediated by images, unquote. The gathering scenes in front of the billboard are a metaphor for what was happening in Italy during the economic boom. While it's still a fragmented nation, socially and geographically, consumerism appears the only thing able to unify the country. As the variegated extras in Fellini's films, Italians feel unified through their participation in the economy, that is, by being part of the spectacle in front of the billboard, that, as the board explains, has to be isolated in order to function. Indeed, the billboard stands in a terrain vague in an underdeveloped area, and it almost anticipates the peripheral location of many malls that will sprout around the borders of the capital at the end of the 1990s. The billboard attracts all the attention from the inhabitants of the neighborhood and beyond, as Antonio himself affirms, and it activates illusion and false consciousness. Moreover, because the billboard is the focus of the attention, the relationship among the population changes. People's interactions are always mediated by the billboard, Anita, and the product advertised, that is, by consumerism. The coronation of consumer capitalism as an Italian national value occurs in the middle of the film. Again, Antonio observes the area in front of the billboard, and he says, quote, in pochi giorni, dico, l'orrendo cartellone, la mostruosa Circe, come ai tempi del vitello d'oro, ha raccolto intorno a sé tutta la corruzione del mondo cittadino, unquote. His words underline the billboard's magnetic power on the population together with the people's devotion towards it, and symbolically consumerism. Indeed, while Antonio speaks, a country festival similar to those connected to saint celebrations materializes in front of the billboard. With this scene, Fellini affirms that during the economic miracle, consumerism becomes part of Italian traditions. It drastically changes them by attracting the population as a new social focal point and modifying traditional values. Divas and commodities are revered like divinities. Fellini stages what the boards elaborates a few years later. According to the Marxist theories, quote, "The spectacle is the material reconstruction of religious illusion. Those cloud-enshrouded entities have now been brought down to earth. It is thus the most earthbound aspect of life that have become the most impenetrable and glorified. The absolute denial of life in the shape of a fallacious paradise is no longer projected to heavens, but finds its place instead within material life itself. The spectacle is hence a technological version of the exiling of human powers in a world beyond, and the perfection of separation within human beings," unquote. The diva Anita is both terrestrial and divine. She bridges earthly materiality to divinity. It is through her billboard that its viewers and symbolically Italians believe to reach the paradise, that is, wealth. The Italian economic miracle is a religious illusion that projects paradise within material life in commodities themselves. Indeed, the heterotopic space in front of the billboard seems accessible to everyone, but it entails exclusion anyway. This is the fifth principle of heterotopia, and I quote, "Everyone can enter into the heterotopic sites, but in fact, that is only an illusion. We think we enter where we are, but the very fact that we enter excluded," unquote. In Le Tentazioni, even if prostitutes, Southern Italians, the proletariat, and also African Americans are free to stand in front of the billboard and dream about wealth, in reality, they are not able to buy the commodity advertised, nor can they live in the rich bourgeois area where the billboard is positioned. The illusion of participating in the economic miracle alters the perception of reality of the proletariat and the marginal figures of the society. To conclude, I have many other things because it is part of like a larger project, but to conclude, Anita is the emblem both of consumer capitalist society at large, but also of modern Italy. She embodies the desire of the nation to appear sexually and intellectually free as well as economically prosperous. But in reality, Anita, as this modernized vision of Italy and society, is as intangible as a projected image on a screen. Thank you.
Eleonora, thank you so much. There's a lot of stuff to discuss in your papers. And let me introduce you our last speaker for today. And later in the Q&A, we will be joined by two presenters who uploaded their presentations asynchronously, Flavia Laviosa and Damiano Pietropaolo. But for now, let me introduce you Federico Pacchioni, who holds the Sebastian Paul and Maribel Masco Endowed Chair in Italian at Chapman University, where he directs the Italian Studies program, teaches Italian as well as interdisciplinary courses, and leads various outreach activities. In his research, he focuses on cases of artistic synergy and intermediality across Italian cinema, literature, and theater. He is the author of more than 30 publications, including several articles in peer-reviewed journals and volumes, translations, reviews, interviews, and creative writings. He is the author of the monographs Inspiring Fellini, Literary Collaborations Behind the Screen in 2014, and L'immagine del burattino, percorsi tra teatro, letteratura e cinema in 2020. And he also co-edited the volume Pierpaolo Pasolini, Prospettive Americane in 2015 with Fulvio Orsitto, and co-authored the new edition of A History of Italian Cinema in 2017 with the late Peter Bondanella. And the title of Federico's presentation is The Genesis of Steiner, La Dolce Vita as Authorial Melting Pot.
Thank you. A big thank you to Marco for the introduction and to the entire organizing committee for putting together such a stimulating conference undeterred by the challenging time we are in. It's been such a great pleasure to hear all these wonderful presentations, as many as I was able to hear in spite of the time zone. So I'm going to use my allotted time to dive into the genesis of one of the characters from La Dolce Vita, Steiner, who is both a crucial and a confusing figure, one that remains somewhat impervious to interpretation, and one that can significantly benefit from a collaborative analysis. The character of Steiner, the apparently serene intellectual figure who suddenly kills himself and his children in Fellini's La Dolce Vita, has been consistently identified as a central but puzzling element of this film. By touching on the cultural and literary origins of Steiner, encompassing Christian dramaturgy, existential philosophy, musicology, and real historic figures such as Cesare Pavese and Roberto Longhi, I would like to suggest the reasons why this character turned into such a complex and contradictory figure, at once serene and heroic and desperate and cowardly. To clarify the character's genesis, we must examine the collaborative exchanges between Fellini and the writers who contributed to the conceptualization of this character, more specifically Tullio Pinelli and Brunello Rondi, and the filmmakers' mediation between their opposing views. Indeed, Steiner, the fruit of conflicting literary, philosophic, and authorial spheres of influence, is a clear example of Fellini's capacity to blend and neutralize contrasting contributions from his screenwriters. A model of successful artistic and personal life in the eyes of the confused Marcello, the intellectual and family man Steiner, played by Alain Cuny, first appears playing an organ in church and encouraging Marcello to pursue his dream of being a writer. Then he appears during a multifaceted party at his own home, filled with endearing family moments and both ecstatic and satirical social vignettes. And finally, again, in his home, this time lifeless on a chair after having shot himself, his children and himself. Steiner represented for Tullio Pinelli the intellectual affected by what he saw as a desperation from an excess of happiness, who is materially realized but spiritually dissatisfied. As Pinelli acknowledged in an interview, the singularly tragic tone of the episode was undermined by the party scene where Steiner is surrounded by rather shallow friends and intellectuals. An episode that, according to Pinelli, clouds the deeper reasons behind the character's desperate actions and therefore the significance of his crisis. Most likely, in Pinelli's point of view, a fitting biographical source for Steiner was the suicidal Cesare Pavese, a childhood friend of his, to whom he had written letters in an attempt to help him find respite in the Christian faith. Remaining instead within the textual domain, Steiner can be fruitfully compared to another of Pinelli's tragic figures, the artist Pietro Rovere, from Lotta con l'Angelo, Struggle with the Angel, written by Pinelli several years before La Dolce Vita, a man who is also dissatisfied with his material achievements and with his failure to properly respond to God's call for self-sacrifice, and who finally kills himself and his wife. It is important to remember that Tullio Pinelli was an exponent of what critic Achille Fiocco in 1955 termed correnti spiritualistiche del teatro moderno, along with the more famous Ugo Betti, Diego Fabbri, and Riccardo Bacchelli. A type of theater where representation is challenged by the attempt to stage the psychological and metaphysical complexities of human reality. Indeed, in Pinelli's writing, tragedy is consistently framed with a religious, definitely Christian perspective, often leading to climatic moments of redemption. His contribution of spirituality. This is a collaborative influence that I have also found in La Strada, for which Pinelli wrote the first version of the script. And if we review Pinelli's role in Fellini's Libro dei Sogni, we find instances such as this one here in the corner, where Fellini for the character of Steiner, Brunello Rondi, another of Fellini's long-term screenwriters, envisioned him as a martyr, both tragic and positive, who was supposed to stand out from the mediocre world of La Dolce Vita by pursuing an ideal of fulfillment through relationships, namely as an embodiment of Rondi's own organic credo. Across his extremely eclectic and prolific activity as a philosopher, a musicologist, a poet, a screenwriter, and even filmmaker, Brunello Rondi expressed his philosophy, which early on he labeled organic, reinterpreting the Gramscian notion of the organic intellectual in a spiritual sense. Briefly put, in Brunello Rondi's thinking, Marxism and Christianity were fused together, and consequently, the word organic becomes not an idea for political activity, but an aesthetic North Star. The main strategy that Rondi used to bring to life his idea of Steiner is musical discourse, developed across two main sequences, and following the specific coordinates of Rondi's own treatise on the evolution of Western classical music and praise of electronic music. In his writings, Rondi often described the organ as a symbol of the polyphony of the past, the emblem of a bygone harmonious relationship with the cosmos, in ways that recall the scene of Marcello's meeting with Steiner in the church. Rondi considered electronic music to be the future of the European classical music tradition, and saw it as a possible way to overcome dodecaphonic fragmentation and incommunicability and embody a more vital rapport of human beings with life. The novel and uncoded sound structure of electronic music were to Rondi an ideal way to probe into the unknown. Certainly more so than the sentimental and comfortable scores written by Nino Rota. During the scene at the party at Steiner's house in La Dolce Vita, Steiner shyly discloses his secret experiments with music to recapture the perfection of Bach's cosmic harmony by recording the sounds of nature, thunder, rain, birds, and wind, and reorganizing them in a new man-made electronic order. The entire scene of Steiner's experiment with sound is absent from the shooting script, a fact that testifies to the significant changes to this part underwent during filmmaking when Rondi was working as the screenwriter on set. Rondi worked with Fellini's party idea, trying to preserve his own Steiner, emphasizing his solitude and approaching demise through his attempt to reawaken the party's guests with the natural vitality of his sound experiments. The authorial interplay behind the character of Steiner explains his complex and at times contradictory nature, presenting him as a lost soul, in line with Pinelli, as a martyr, in line with Rondi. Fellini's comedic directorial hand portrayed the community of helpless and somewhat squalid artists around Steiner in his usual caricaturist manner, simultaneously softening the inexplicable tragedy that Pinelli wished for and undermining the heroic intellectual figure that Rondi conceived. And I don't have the necessary time here to do full justice to all of the influences that come together in this beautiful part of La Dolce Vita. However, allow me to mention as I move to close my presentation, that to make matters even more complex, Pierpaolo Pasolini also wrote his version of the sequences involving Steiner, whom he named Mattioli, making him originally from Romagna, as Marcello also is, and an ex-student of the art historian Roberto Longhi, as Pasolini himself was. Probably Steiner inspired Pasolini as another example of an urban He owns land in Romagna, and his beautiful house with a panoramic view of Rome is decorated with important works of art. Stability, he lives in an idyllic life with his family, and prestige. He's an accomplished author and professor, as Pasolini's writing go. Pasolini's pages, however, never common ground that Fellini strikes between Pinelli's and Rondi's views of Steiner, which we could summarize as the capitulation of a highly sensitive individual whose carefully guarded purity eventually can no longer withstand the mediocrity and pessimism of society, would seem to match well with a Pasolinian perspective. To conclude, the puzzle of Steiner's Genesis is a telling example of the way Fellini cunningly employed different contributions, thus offsetting the qualities he appreciated less in his writers. This is an ability that plays an important role in much of the poignancy of Fellini's cinema. Steiner's case also shows how Fellini's authorial vision developed through and because of contrasting collaborations, and shows that differences in sensibilities and interests were factors that lent an extraordinary complexity and completedness to many of Fellini's more acclaimed films, of which La Dolce Vita is only one example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Federico. Thanks a lot, and there's a lot to discuss here. Now, before we move to the Q&A, as I said, I would like to introduce two other guests whose presentations are uploaded on the conference website at the bottom of the schedule page. The first one is Flavia Laviosa. Presentation is titled Genealogy and Polycentrism of Italian Media through the Journal of Italian Media and Cinema Study. Flavia is senior lecturer in the Department of Italian Studies and in the Cinema and Media Studies program at Wellesley College. Her research interests are Italian women, filmmaker, and representations of violence against women in war cinema. She has published numerous articles in refereed journals and chapters in edited volumes. Laviosa is the founding editor of the book series Trajectories of Italian Cinema and Media, and of the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies, both published by Intellect. The issue of SEC, Cinematic Journeys of Italian Women Directors in 2011, and edited the volume Visions of Struggle in Women's Filmmaking in the Mediterranean in 2010. While Damiano Pietropaolo, here you are, based on one by Fellini called The Matchbox. Damiano is an award-winning writer and broadcaster, director, translator, and educator. And his translations include the Fellini radio plays, translated and adapted for stage, from radio plays by Federico Fellini, which were presented at Stanford Festival in 2002. Essays, reviews, and creative nonfiction have appeared in Saturday Night magazines, the Globe and Mail, Grill magazine, CBC Radio, and Il Quotidiano La Calabria. And as editor, director, and producer, Damiano explore the theme of exile and return and the emergence of post-national drama in such series as Where is Here, the drama of immigration, and Little Italy's. Now, before we move on to the Q&A for the speakers, you know, who just appeared in this panel, I would just like to ask a few questions to Flavia and to Damiano, just to, you know, involve them in the general conversation. And I will start with Flavia. Flavia, I would like to ask you, you know, as editor of the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies, on which your presentation is, of course, centered, I would like to ask you what's, in your opinion, the importance of Fellinian scholarship in the overall amount of contributions you receive, and if, correct me if I'm wrong, but there's also a monographic issue coming out next year on Fellini, am I correct?
Yes. Thank you, Mark, and hello, everyone. Thank you so much for, I thank the conference organizers for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this event with a recorded presentation of the Journal of Italian Cinema and Media Studies, and to illustrate its history, its goals, aims, accomplishments, and new directions. So to answer your question, Marco, yes, in order to be, journal has included Fellini as one of the maestri del cinema italiano in international critical debate. I would like to share some, and I hope it is there. Do you all see my slides? Okay.
I see.
So it may, it took me some time to go over what the journal in its 8-9 years of a production has published. And I was almost surprised, because as an editor loses track of what is accomplished over time, that indeed as early as 2014, which was the second official year of publication of the journal, we started publishing a number of book reviews. And so we had in 2014, Viaggio al termine dell'Italia, Fellini Politico by Andrea Minus. In 2015, Federico Fellini, Painting in Film, Painting on Film by Hava Al-Dubai. I hope I'm pronouncing her last name correctly. Inspiring Fellini, Literary Collaborations, Behind the Scenes by Federico Pacchioni. And in 2018, in 2 consecutive issues, we published 2 additional book reviews. Giovane Fellini nello splendente fulgore della vita by Enzo Lavagnini, and Federico Fellini, Riprese, Riletture, Revisioni by Bernardini, Granata, Lo Balsamo, and Zambenedetti. So this gives you a sense of what we have accomplished in terms of book reviews. The journal has also published a variety of and a number of articles on where Fellini is specifically the object of critical attention and also is being referred to. I have selected those articles where Fellini is one of the filmmakers fully discussed in the articles. I have left those where Fellini is referenced to. So in 2014, we have this very interesting comparison between on the influence of Fellini on Chinese cinema, and we have this article, Configuring Innocence, China and Italy, Wang and Messina Personas. This article was published in one of the 2 special issues on the intersections between Italian and Asian cinemas. In 2018, we published the Critical Self-Reflections in the Elusive Other, the image of the Austrian and I cannot read my own slide because it's covered by so the films of Visconti, Fellini, and Cavani. These so a comparative analysis between the films of these three great filmmakers. In 2019, interpolating the blah blah blah, the greater beauties of vocal Rome, and here there is inevitably a comparison between the great beauty and Fellini's work, Sorrentino and Fellini. In 2020, the very first issue of the 8th volume opens, and it inaugurates the year, opens the year with a compelling, a profoundly theoretical and innovative article, Fellini's 8.5 Dreams, Guilt, Casting, and the Code of Codes of the Cinematographic Image by two colleagues from Sandra Meire and Odeya Cohen-Raz. So as you see, and as we move forward, I don't know if to answer fully your question, Marco, you mentioned the special issue, the guest edited issue that is forthcoming. It is the first issue of the 9th volume. It's the official date is 2021, but we hope to have it published and available online as early as November, at the latest early December. So this guest edited issues was conceived and produced by Clizia Centorino, Marco Dalla Gassa, and Andrea Minus. We, the authors, and myself, were particularly grateful to the Scola family because they gave us permission to reproduce Ettore Scola's drawing of Fellini. The title is With a Hat and a Red Scarf, the Building of Federico Fellini's Public Image. I wonder if you wish me to go on with the articles included in this issue, or if I should pause right now.
Well, I mean, they're also in your presentation. We're also uploaded in your presentation, so maybe that might be enough if you think so.
If I may also acknowledge the publication of the book series that you mentioned, and that the very first monograph is our Frank Berke book, Fellini's Films and Commercials from Post-War to Postmodern. So to conclude, both the journal and the book series have covered Fellini in different ways and over time, and has included the various issues. I have welcomed the voices of international colleagues of literally from different parts of the different continents at this point. Thank you, Marco.
Thanks. And thanks a lot. And of course, Flavia will be here for the rest of the Q&A. So if anyone has, questions about the journal or the journal policies and so on, feel free to ask. Now, Damiano, I've been listening to your radio drama, which is surprisingly creepy. I found it very disturbing, but it's very, very well made. And it's also very, timely that you are here with us today when we've discussed in this panel a lot about Fellini's intermediality and so on. So I was wondering, could you give us some details about, how you started this project? What were your sources?
2002, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Back in 2002, the Stratford Festival approached me with the idea that they wanted to stage 3 radio plays by Federico Fellini, and they needed a translation and an adaptation for the stage. And this created a huge challenge for me, because I was to translate Fellini's language into English, but also translate from the radio into the stage, across two platforms, in other words. And this proved to be a wonderful introduction to a part of Fellini that I didn't even know existed, his work in radio. This is a much neglected aspect of Fellini's work. But from 1940 to 1943, he worked for AR, which is the predecessor to Rai Radio. And he wrote about 100 or so of these scripts. The reason why I staged or produced the Matchbox is because that's the very first example of Fellini writing dialogue in dramatic form. And so according to Tullio Kesic, who's a great friend and critic, of course, he says that's where Fellini cut his dramaturgical teeth. That's where he understood how dramaturgically he could move into it. Now, what fascinated me about that was at the same time as he was writing scripts for neo-realistic directors, he escaped into radio in a total fantasy world. And there are, of the three plays, I think the first one is the Matchbox, in the Matchbox, which is kind of a tonal tribute to Laurel and Hardy in many ways, with a note, a tipping of the hat to Arlecchino. It's a comedy. He approaches, on the one hand, silent cinema, or the cinema of the 30s, with great comic, farcical, elements such as the Laurel and Hardy and Buster Keaton, and he goes back into the commedia dell'arte as well. So popular culture on the one hand, and cinematic culture as it was emerging. But one of the things that interested me about this is how he was able to write idiomatically for the medium itself. And I won't be too long, but there are two other plays that I would like to mention. First of all, the Matchbox, those of you who have heard it, will have come across the idea that what this essentially is a striptease on radio. It's about disrobing and rerobing. And so the two of them are in a situation in which this swindle is taking place. The rich, well-dressed man is robbed of his clothes and eventually his girlfriend. And it is creepy in that sense, but it's creepy by design on my part, because it takes us into another world of Fellini's subconscious imagination. The other plays that I did for the festival were a play called Love Letters. And Love Letters is a dialogue between two young lovers, one of whom is leaving to go to work in the city. And this is, I'll write you. The point is, he's illiterate and she's illiterate. So they exchange white pages. Like Mallarmé's best poem being the white page, there's a sense in which the characters then pour themselves into an emptiness, if you like, that is represented by these white pages. And what began to emerge for me is that through his work in radio, Federico Fellini was actually becoming Fellini-esque. That the Matchbox is the beginning of a journey in radio that ends 3 years later with fully realized radio plays, particularly one called Fuori Programma Numero 7, which is a kind of foreshadows Fellini's 8½. This is about a radio studio director who invites the audiences to send him challenges. And one of the great challenges that is sent by it's pure radio. I mean, you call in and you have an exchange, and then that exchange results maybe in a radio play. In this particular case, the one challenge he had was from a man who said, "I bet you can't do this. Can you devise a play on where sounds go to die?" Where sounds go to die. All of a sudden it becomes a metaphysical exploration of sound and memory. And the protagonist of this play is a man called Roberto, and he's leaving he's just been dumped by his girlfriend. And so he hears constantly her voice, "I love you, Roberto, I love you, Roberto." But it's getting feebler and feebler and feebler. And so the solution that Fellini comes up with is he's to take a train, and when he reaches the terminal point of the terminus point, he will hear for the last time, "Roberto, I love you." And then the sound becomes a complete echo. It becomes a memory. So Fellini is using the radio to explore elements that he then explores in 8½, but also in Amarcord, which is the great film about memory and sound. So one of the things that interested me in this, and I think that it's a much neglected aspect of Fellini, and it should be probably studied further, is that in Fellini's radio play, the dramaturgy of sound takes him into a world in which sound is as important as image. So that, in most films, we think of sound as supporting the image, the visual storytelling. In Fellini, they share equal weight. There's equal dramaturgical weight between the soundscape and the visual scape. And I think Amarcord has its roots in some of the work he did on radio. And one of the actors who worked with him on radio was a great friend of his and a great radio personality in Italy called Elio Pandolfi, who said he was trying to get me to do an accent that was so precise that I couldn't do it. He wanted me to do the accent of a German person speaking Italian with a Bolognese accent. So this was the challenge he was in. And then he said, Elio, and I'm quoting Fellini, nulla esiste, tutto è sognabile. And in radio, he could dream at large in a way that he couldn't, that eventually he dreamt fully on the screen. But that's where he cut. We're talking about a 25-year-old now, 22, 23-year-old author who is coming from satirical cartoons, coming from neorealism on the one hand, but he escapes into a place called the radio studio where he actually can dream in a way that he dreamt much later and more sophisticatedly in 8.5 and Amarcord and so on. So I'll stop there.
Damiano, thanks. It's been extremely interesting, and I invite you all, of course, to check out the presentations, the presentation and the radio drama on our website in case you haven't done it yet. And again, it's very interesting because we do talk a lot about other forms of art in Fellini's movies, but not as much as the fact that Fellini himself was devoted to several other forms of art, and I would really like to know something more about these radio plays in the future. Now, I've read that Frank is about to leave us. Frank, do you want to ask anything to our guests before signing off?
Oh, I would have something to say. This is great. I really enjoyed it so much, and I'd want to say something to everybody, and that would take way too long. So let me just thank you for a really, really enjoyable morning. And I look forward to tomorrow morning as well. The stuff about radio is just mind-boggling. And because there are two people I know very well who are doing a lot of work on sound and Fellini right now, and I'm going to clip that section of the presentation and send it to both of them. So that's just so illuminating and great. But everything was just really terrific. And thank you for your hosting as well. Wonderful job.
Yes, sorry, I was just checking Umberto's messages. Said his internet is done and he's back. Daniela, thanks, Frank. Daniela, yes. Sorry, you have to, yes.
Yes, no, yes, and I want to thank you too, and I actually want to apologize about not being able to be here tomorrow morning because I'm behind with a dissertation I have to read. It's got a defense next week and papers to grade, so please forgive me. But I know that it's going to be recorded, correct? Everything, so I could listen to and see the presentation later on. Okay, that's very good. No, I just wanted to make a little comment on Manuela. Manuela, you know how much I like you and your work, and I miss you. And I followed your talk, with great interest. And of course, when you quoted Fellini, I think it was a quote when you say, "Do we believe what we see, or do we see what we believe?" That's Fellini's, correct? Of course, the two things are connected, aren't they? We do, end up seeing what we believe because we have believed what we saw to begin with. And maybe, sorry, I am in the United States. I know you are in Bologna. You are lucky. You are in Canada. And I don't know how many people are in the United States here, maybe 2 or 3. But for me right now, to read something like do we see what we believe, considering the political situation we are living in right now, is just sort of, it gives me goosebumps. But I have voted, so, and I want to, I want to thank you very much, because that's been really for me, a moment, even last week, in which I fortunately didn't have to think about COVID and the political situation in the United States. So thank you very much. I will stay for a few more minutes, but forgive me when you see me disappear. Thank you.
Marco, mi consenti di dire una cosa alla mia amica Daniela? Prima che sparisca dal monitor
Ci
dalla mia
mancherebbe
vita, che non ci vediamo mai. No, allora intanto volevo dire una cosa che prima presa dalla frenziness delle tecnologie che io col quale ho un rapporto molto stupido. Non ho ringraziato Marco, non ho ringraziato Alberto e tutti gli organizzatori, ma soprattutto non ho ringraziato tutti coloro che hanno partecipato e stanno partecipando, perché anche le sessioni della settimana scorsa sono state bellissime. Vorrei ringraziare anche questi ragazzi giovani molto bravi che francamente ci fanno ben sperare per gli studi di cinema e di Italian cinema in particolare. Finalmente forse qualche voce giovane ci serve. Per rispondere, no, anche un altro modo di guardare le cose è sempre benvenuto. Mi è piaciuto molto la lezione, anche il paper scusami, di Eleonora su appunto le tentazioni del dottor Antonio. Se non ti dispiace ti mando una piccolissima cosa che feci per un convegno su Peppino di Filippo, quindi prendila così, è una cosa così, cioè fatta però magari dentro c'è qualcosa, quindi te lo manderò. No, volevo rispondere un attimo a Daniela, perché in realtà, e grazie per aver votato, avrei voluto essere americana per votare anch'io stavolta, quindi davvero. E la cosa che lui sta dicendo però si riconnette a tutto quel discorso che tu hai posto peraltro a Veronica, che mi dispiace non ci sia, mi ha chiesto di spedire, poi parlerò con lei, sulla questione dell'autenticità. Cioè, in fondo lui sta dicendo quello che tu stavi dicendo, capisci? Cioè, questo è il problema. Per lui non è un problema così importante, no, la questione dell'autenticità. Questo è. E si lega, infatti mentre voi ne parlavate io pensavo a questa piccola citazione che io avevo e che in fondo è utile per capire il suo atteggiamento, capito? Cioè la cosa che gli interessa non è quella, è come far comunicare questi mondi, capito? Cioè qual è il canale di comunicazione che si apre tra l'esterno e l'interno, tra il reale e l'immaginario. Mi spiace che non ci sia Frank, no? E quello che io sto tentando di fare con poco successo, ma insomma è l'inizio di un percorso per guardare Fellini in un modo diverso da come ho sempre guardato, e non tanto vedere accade nei film, ma vedere qual è il processo comunicativo fra queste dimensioni dell'esperienza che per lui sono così importanti. Ecco perché per esempio Damiano, grazie, anch'io ho lavorato un po' sui testi dei suoi programmi radiofonici e peraltro andando nell'archivio della Nazionale ne ho trovati 2 inediti ancora, quindi ci sono 2 che non sono stati ancora, cioè bisogna che vai lì, ti metti i guanti a scartabellare, li trovi, e sono lavori molto importanti. E hai ragione, hai ragionissimo quando dici che la questione del suono per lui è importantissima, che è quello che dice alla fine della voce della luna, Quando Roberto Ivo Salvini chiede il silenzio, sta parlando di quello, sta parlando dell'importanza della sonorità. Ecco perché io parlo di estesia, di empatia, della sensorialità dell'esperienza, capito? Per lui è lì che il canale, per Fellini è quello. Cioè per lui l'esperienza è sensoriale, cioè ha a che vedere con i sensi. Cioè non è...
C'è un documentario su Fellini che in uno studio che lavora sul doppiaggio della voce di Sutherland, che la fa Gigi Proietti. E
sì.
lui di Proietti, cioè la cosa più importante in questo piccolo documentario è che Fellini, quando dirige l'attore che fa il doppiaggio, chiude gli occhi e non guarda lo schermo.
Bellissimo.
Cioè lui dà al suono.
Lo vuole lo vuole,
no, non vuole
sentire.
vuole soltanto
Sì,
sentire.
lo vuole solo sentire, sì,
Vuole
sì,
solo
esatto.
sentire. Cioè, e che è una tecnica ovviamente radiofonica, cioè lui cancella il mondo visivo e dà una più importanza al mondo sonoro. Cioè. E ci sono delle cose che poi Fellini anche ha imparato alla radio, ma che ha portato nel cinema. Per esempio, chi non conosce l'autenticità la singolarità, vorrei dire, del suono del vento di Fellini? È un vento artificiale, è stato creato in uno studio, però è una specie di firma di Fellini. Cioè, quando arriva questo vento, che lo trovi in Amarcord, lo trovi nell'8 e mezzo, lo trovi dappertutto. Cioè, ci sono altri modi di usare il suono come elemento drammaturgico molto molto importante nella sua opera.
No, grazie per il contributo, perché tu sei un uomo di teatro, quindi vedi delle cose che magari appunto sfuggono, si occupa di messa in scena in termini proprio pratici, no? Cioè, hai un occhio particolare, hai una sensibilità particolare per queste cose, che però ci aiutano a capire meglio anche a noi che invece ci occupiamo di questioni testuali, magari siamo più...
Secondo me questi testi vanno pubblicati, vanno tradotti, vanno messi in scena, è stato un mondo... Fellini non ne parlava molto tanto della sua esperienza alla radio, ma secondo Tullio Kesic, che lo conosce molto bene ovviamente, è stato un momento di formazione molto molto importante per lui, il lavoro alla radio. Sì.
Vabbè, certo.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Manuela, and thanks, Daniela, for your question. And I've read in our chat that Alberto has a question for Eleonora.
Yeah, thank you, Marco. My internet is very unstable today, so I apologize if the question is not as clear as it could be. I was really struck by your paper. First of all, thank you for mentioning my small, very small, minute contribution to the literature about that film. And in that piece, I sort of argue that the error there's an impossibility about the error, which is the fact that it remains tied to the legacy of fascism. So even when the buildings sort of like vault over the neoclassical styles that have come to be identified with the architecture of fascist architecture, although of course by fascist architecture we mean actually a plethora of different architectural styles. On the other side of the Palazzo della Civiltà, you have Palazzo dei Ricevimenti, and that is already the rationalism of Alberto Libera is stands in stark contrast with the homogenizing style of neoclassicism. And in my piece I kind of make this argument that whatever when you put the camera there, you are inevitably contending with the legacy of fascism. And of you're also thinking about the possibility of fascism kind of returning in future dystopias and things of that sort. And one thing I did not think about at all was and this shows my own sort of like also limited thinking at the time. The article's about 10 years old. Is what Shalene pointed out last week, which is the fact that those buildings not only have and always will continue to connote fascism, but they also can reveal fascism's kind of like colonial unconscious, and it's in shooting in the air and in inevitably interacting with those buildings. Fellini is in fact participating in a kind of unearthing of that unconscious. And I found it incredibly fascinating that you do a reading of the buildings in relation to a sort of like their second incarnation, or the second thrust, which is this removal, or kind of like this moving away from those buildings, from the colonial unconscious and the fascist heritage towards the modern reclaiming, in a sense, of rewriting the history of that neighborhood that's lodged in the economic boom. And I just, I find it such a rich and textually, generative approach that I was wondering if you had any thoughts, about this possible sort of like triangulation of moments for the error, that, is fascist, then becomes, expresses itself in the economic boom and the Rome Olympics, and then if eventually is there's a critical recuperation or a critical return to it that unveils this colonial unconscious that we have forgotten for a long time, and that of course becomes part of the polemics about the fascist buildings. Should we qualify them? Should we not qualify them? And interpolates all the discourses around removals of statues and things of that sort. I find your paper is kind of like sitting at the center of this polemics about the history of the error. So I'm wondering what you think about that. Sorry for the long-winded question, but I really appreciated your paper.
I want to start with a quotation from the interview that Fellini gave in 1972 that I quoted, but I didn't quote like a specific part, which is also like a kind of paradox, but it helps in like developing this idea, because it says, I don't have the word for word, but it says that it really likes Eur as a set because like he can play there as if like to move toys around and things, because Eur is without history. And saying that Eur is without history is a very big paradox. But like I can understand how it says this. I was talking about this also with Giuliana Minghelli last week in the breakout rooms. And it is because the architecture, like the fascist architecture, which, as you said, like it has many styles, like the rationalist style, but also the simplified neoclassicism. And like the point in common of this architecture is that, like, yes, they refer to the past, but it is anchored in the present, and like it builds for the future. It is like finding some common points, like across past, present, and future. Like it is utopic in a sense of way, because it looks for order and symmetry. So like they try to like these values are embedded in this architecture, and like they try to cross all these centuries. Like this said, like when also it is paradoxical because it said it is without history, and because it has never had like it was never part of the community. Like it was like monuments left there, but it also erases, like these comments erases part, because it was lived, like there were refugees and gutters there. So it is, I think it is also paradoxical because of this, because it erases part of its history. But going forward, like in the film, like I have many, like long analysis of how the architecture is used, but I didn't have the time to talk about this in the paper. Like it is used, and like with commercials. So like Eur is changed and it is transformed, like it happened at the Terme di Caracalla in La Dolce Vita. Like it is full of advertisements, and it is really connected to the economic miracle, because also the tracking shot when Anita leaves the billboard and she walks, she's a giant, and she walks in Viale della Civiltà del Lavoro. Like the first image, like the first two images are really, really there for seconds, but I think they're really important because you have like a gas station and also Banca Nazionale del Lavoro. So like those are key in the economic miracle, but they go back to the end of the 19th century when the nation was born. And also the same thing can be said of the other neon signs that you see that are stock, Campari, I don't remember what else, but also those like are key products in the 1960s for the Italian miracle and for the Made in Italy. But all of them had roots. They were born during like Risorgimento or immediately after post-Risorgimento. So there are these things of foundation of nation, but also economy that are combined in this striking shot. For the present state of architecture, fascism, like I'm starting to think about that, especially this summer with Black Lives Matter movement. But I don't right now. I don't have an answer for these and the film. Like I can say that in the film itself, there are the African Americans, and Shilin Green was talking about them, and like she helped me to think a little bit more about them. Like I have something in my paper, but it is more of a general step, like kind of Pasolini, that it starts from Italy and then it goes beyond and starts talking about the global world, the global society. So it is more that the US are a model for Italy and like the economic miracle. And there are the African American, but there are also many hints, like there is the drive-in, there are skyscrapers, there is Birreria del West. So there are many hints in the film. So I stopped thinking about that at that point. Like it is a discourse on global and how like the marginal Italian figures can just be compared, like it happened during World War II cinema or immediately after, where there was this comparison between the state of African Americans and Italians. Stop here. It's getting too long, but if you have more questions, just
Thank you so much. You know, it was a fabulous paper. Really. As was Ottavio's, thank you, Andrew, for reading it and for sharing it with such care and attention. It really made me feel like we really lost a giant. He clearly was thinking about Fellini in deep and in illuminating ways. And I just want to say thank you.
Oh, and thank you so much. And I just wanted to also thank you and the team again from Rita, who just sent me a message and said it was lovely, and so she just wants to extend her heartfelt thank you to you as well. As you said, yeah, Otta was it was so passionate, just like all of you, and he was looking at it from his own particular way, and so I'm happy that we could contribute this to the conversation. But again, thank you to all the presenters. I thought your work is fantastic and so interesting. Even for somebody like me, I don't come from cinema studies, but I learned so much today. So again, thank you, Dr. Zambenedetti, and to the organizers and the panelists. I appreciate very much.
Thank you.
Francamente, grazie Andrew. In realtà non ho detto niente perché tu mi hai quasi commosso oggi con questa cosa. Cioè mi è rimasto un groppo in gola, voglio dire, sinceramente. Ma il lavoro che ha fatto sull'urbanistica è bellissimo. Speriamo che sia pubblicato, insomma, quello che avete. Ci farebbe piacere. C'ho un po' un groppo in gola a pensare a lui in questo momento, quindi va bene, grazie comunque, grazie tanto.
No, ma grazie mille, Manuela. Dillo a me, guarda, io e Otta ci siamo conosciuti quando avevamo 7 anni alle elementari e siamo stati migliori amici da quel momento, quindi puoi immaginare per me. Volevo dirti che abbiamo ritrovato nel computer di Otta una scaletta proprio con i capitoli di ricerca e altri appunti, e quindi speriamo di poter organizzarci per magari avere un draft di qualche cosa che può essere pubblicato posthumously. E quello sarebbe il top. Quindi grazie mille, Manuela, apprezzo molto.
Grazie.
Yes, I've just read that Federico has to leave us. I did kind of have a question for you, but if you it's not important if you have to go teaching.
But
it's
now
fine.
you made me curious. I want to hear it.
I just wanted you to comment on very quickly on a kind of a minor detail in the Steiner episode, which is Morandi's painting, because you talking about Longhi of course, I've always wondered what's kind of the real meaning of the presence of that painting in that scene. And now that you mentioned Longhi, it just popped up again in my head. What would you say is just a way to characterize Steiner?
Well, actually, I would direct you to a book that was published very recently by Mauro Aprile Zanetti, and he wrote a little booklet, but it's a really interesting reflection on that particular moment of the sequence with Steiner, and he entirely focuses his discussion on that painting by Morandi, and brings out all of the backstory behind the integration of that painting and the possible ramifications of its significance. So really look up for that book, Mauro Aprile Zanetti.
I have a short, very, very small question for Damiano, if you don't mind. That is really sort of like a linguistic curiosity more than anything else. So there are two expressions that really struck me in the Matchbox, because they're you know, very much true to the English language. When they say "Long live Charles V," and
Yes.
"You are a gentleman and a scholar."
Yes.
You know, when you're translating, there's various techniques and things like that, and so I'm curious as to what lies sort of like behind those expressions in the original text, and why those expressions in particular.
Well, we toyed with the idea of actually translating into something that is more common in the English language, like "Long live the Queen" or something. But it's just a way. It's used for distracting. He distracts he's going to be swindling. So it has that function. And within the Italian tradition, of course, Charles V is "Viva Carlo Quinto." It's not particularly meaningful or meaningless. It's just a way of calling attention to the fact that the sophisticated swindler is knowing what he's doing here. It's a trap, in other words, for him. But with respect to your question about language, here's another one for you that if you don't mind. There is at one point in the Fuori Programma Numero 7, which is one of the 3 plays that I translated. At one point, the director, who is narcissistic and who is, I can do anything, I can direct anything, a listener calls in and says, I bet you can't direct the dialogue of 2 fish. And Fellini comes up with a perfect solution. The 2 fish speak Neapolitan. So the Neapolitan language, which is very aquatic, very sensual. So in that sense, so the 2 fish all become the disembodied voices of these 2 fish who are speaking in Neapolitan. And how do you translate that into English? How do you make it work on a stage at Stratford or on radio if you were doing it? And my only conclusion was that the way to do it would be either to translate it into a Newfoundland English or New Jersey Italian American, which makes it so that with Fellini, he was so careful with his language, and he worked in post-sync all the time, right? So he was very, very careful to control the dialogue. It gave him the kind of freedom that if you're recording dialogue synchronously, you don't have that kind of freedom. You have to live with what you get. But in his case, all of his were post-sync, and so he approached language as a very different element of filmmaking. It's not just for communication. Language becomes an end in itself. If you think of Amarcord, for instance, where the actual centrality of the language, the dialect and the Bolognese and the Emiliano, it calls attention to itself. And one of the things that is true about Italian movie makers of that generation is not just true of Fellini, but it's also true of Sergio Leone, for instance, where the operatic tradition of Italy kind of has a great influence on the way they think about in some cases, in Sergio Leone, for instance, if you think of Once Upon a Time in the West, that film is about a sound. It's just one sound. Right? In Fellini's case, he also had Nino Rota compose music before he recorded the scene. So there are situations in which Donald Sutherland got very angry with Fellini when he was being directed for Casanova. And the story goes, and I don't think it's apocryphal because it's, is that Sutherland was told, you just say, uno, due, tre, I put language after Donaldino. Of course, you don't treat an actor like that, but Fellini, did and got away with it because he was more interested in fitting the scene, the visual, to the oral, not the other way around. So the radio plays are full of that. There are radio plays, for instance, that Un uomo allo specchio, lo metto allo specchio. It's a short little thing. It's about a man who's seeing himself in a mirror, which we don't see, of course, because it's a radio play. But he sees himself in the mirror, and the image talks back to him as his separate self. There's a kind of a split self thing. And it's when he was a little boy. He says, oh, come sei cresciuto, come sei diverso. So it's in a dialogue with himself. And he uses radio in a marvelous way as a medium that isn't there simply to tell a story, but it is there to create a musical soundscape in which the story is cradled. And that's true of the number. There are not many of these, radio plays that should be, published, should be translated. There's a whole aspect of Fellini that hasn't been studied yet, and that would be a good place to start. I don't know if I answered your question, but
yes, you have. Thank you so much.
Poi però Damiano, un piccolo scherzo, cioè, it's a joke, non è né emiliano né bolognese. Guarda che da noi, tra Emilia e Romagna, c'è una battaglia, c'è una battaglia, come tutti gli italiani. Romagnolo, perché sono due cose proprio diverse. Io sono figlia di un romagnolo e di un'emiliana. Cioè mia madre è proprio alla frontiera tra Emilia e Romagna. E mio padre invece era proprio romagnolo. Nonostante questo litigavano continuamente sulle cose. Quindi,
thanks for your further comments on this, rather interesting issue. And I mean, we are but happy few. We are very happy, but also very few. So I would say that we could finish for today. And I want to thank you all very much for your papers. It's been very interesting. It's been a great discussion, and I was honored to, moderate this session. And I want to thank Andrew again for bringing his contribution in celebrating Ottavio's memory. And I hope I'll see you all tomorrow for the fourth and last day of our conference. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for including radio in the conference. Thank you.
Have a lovely day or evening.
Bye-bye.